The early morning mist hung low over the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Captain James Harrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. 23 years of faithful service to the crown had taught him that presentation mattered almost as much as duty itself. The gold braiding on his red tunic caught the first rays of sunlight filtering through the Gothic windows of the guardhouse, where he stood preparing for what should have been another routine day of royal protection. At 45, Captain Harrison commanded respect not just from his rank, but from the quiet authority that came with decades of unwavering loyalty. His weathered face bore the subtle marks of a man who had seen both the grandeur and the shadows of royal life. Yet his steel-gray eyes remained sharp and alert. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the unusual tension that had been building in the palace corridors over the past few weeks, or maybe it was the cryptic message he had received the previous evening from the Queen Consort's private secretary. The Royal Guard had always operated under a strict hierarchy of command, with ultimate authority flowing from the monarch down through carefully established channels. Captain Harrison understood this system intimately, having risen through its ranks from a young guardsman fresh out of military academy to his current position as one of the most trusted protectors of the royal family. His men looked up to him not just as a commander, but as a living embodiment of the oath they had all sworn to protect the crown with their lives. The message that had arrived at his quarters the previous evening was brief but formal, requesting his presence in the Queen Consort's private drawing room at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. Such direct communication from Queen Camilla was unusual, as most coordination between the Guard and the royal household typically flowed through established protocols and intermediaries. The tone of the message suggested urgency, though its purpose remained mysteriously unclear. As Captain Harrison made his way through the familiar corridors of the castle, he reflected on the changes that had swept through the monarchy in recent years. The death of Queen Elizabeth II had marked the end of an era, ushering in King Charles III and fundamentally altering the dynamics of palace life. Queen Camilla, once a controversial figure, had gradually established herself within the royal household, though her relationship with various palace staff and traditions remained complex and sometimes strained. The corridors of Windsor Castle seemed to whisper with centuries of history as Harrison's polished boots echoed against the stone floors. Portraits of long-dead monarchs gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow his progress through the maze of royal apartments and ceremonial chambers. He had walked these same paths thousands of times, yet today each step felt weighted with an inexplicable sense of anticipation. Arriving at the ornate doors leading to the Queen Consort's private quarters, Harrison paused to straighten his uniform once more before announcing his presence to the footman stationed outside. The young man, clearly nervous about something, ushered him into an antechamber where several other palace staff members waited in uncomfortable silence. Their faces bore expressions of concern and confusion that only heightened Harrison's growing sense that this morning would be unlike any other in his long career. The Queen Consort's private drawing room was an elegant space decorated in soft blues and golds, with fresh flowers arranged throughout, and morning sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the castle's private gardens. Queen Camilla sat behind an antique writing desk, her posture rigid and her expression uncharacteristically stern. She wore a navy blue dress suit that emphasized her authority, and her carefully styled hair framed a face that seemed to have aged considerably in recent weeks. Several other individuals were present in the room, including Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Queen Consort's principal lady-in-waiting, and Sir Roderick Pemberton, the castle's deputy master of ceremonies. Their presence suggested that whatever was about to unfold had been carefully orchestrated and carried significant weight within the palace hierarchy. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if everyone present was waiting for something momentous to occur. Captain Harrison executed a precise bow upon entering the room, his military training evident in every movement. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "you requested my presence this morning." His voice carried the confidence of a man accustomed to addressing royalty, yet there was an underlying note of curiosity about the unusual circumstances of this summons. Queen Camilla regarded him with an expression that seemed to blend authority with something approaching disdain. Her eyes, usually warm and engaging during public appearances, now held a coldness that Harrison had never witnessed before. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before she finally spoke, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room tense with anticipation. "Captain Harrison," she began, her words measured and deliberate. "I have been observing the operations of the Royal Guard with growing concern. There are certain protocols and traditions that I believe require immediate adjustment to better reflect the current needs of the monarchy." Her tone suggested that this was not a discussion or consultation, but rather the delivery of a decision that had already been made. The captain listened carefully, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite his growing confusion about where this conversation was heading. In his experience, any changes to guard protocols would typically be discussed at length with senior military advisors and palace officials before being implemented. The fact that he was being informed directly by the Queen Consort, without apparent consultation with his superiors, struck him as highly irregular. "Your Majesty," Harrison replied respectfully, "I am always ready to discuss any concerns you may have regarding our operations. The Royal Guard exists to serve the Crown according to established protocols that have ensured effective protection for generations." His response was diplomatic, but carried an underlying firmness that suggested his commitment to proper procedures. Queen Camilla's expression hardened slightly at his response. She stood from behind her desk and moved to the center of the room, her movement commanding attention from everyone present. The morning light from the windows created an almost theatrical effect, casting her in stark relief against the elegant furnishings of the chamber. "Captain," she said, her voice rising slightly, "I believe you misunderstood the nature of this meeting. I am not here to discuss or negotiate. I am here to inform you of changes that will take effect immediately." The authority in her voice was unmistakable, yet there was something in her manner that suggested these changes might not have the backing of established royal protocol. The other palace staff members exchanged glances, their discomfort evident as they witnessed this unprecedented confrontation between the Queen Consort and one of the most respected members of the Royal Guard. Lady Margaret shifted nervously in her chair, while Sir Roderick appeared to be studying his hands with unusual intensity, as if trying to distance himself from whatever was about to unfold. Harrison felt a chill run through him as he began to understand that this meeting was heading in a direction that could challenge everything he had dedicated his life to protecting. The Queen Consort's next words would set in motion a series of events that would test the very foundations of royal tradition and the unshakable loyalty that had defined his entire career. "Captain Harrison," Queen Camilla said, her voice now carrying an unmistakable tone of command, "I am ordering you and your men to demonstrate your loyalty to the new order of this monarchy. The traditions and protocols you hold so dear are relics of a bygone era that no longer serve the needs of a modern royal household." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking the approach of a moment that would forever change the relationship between the Royal Guard and the crown they had sworn to protect. Harrison could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him as he prepared to respond to a command that would challenge everything he believed about duty, honor, and the sacred oath he had taken so many years ago. As Queen Camilla continued to speak, outlining her vision for a radically reformed Royal Guard structure, Harrison realized that he was about to face the most difficult decision of his military career. The traditions he had spent his life upholding were under direct assault, and his response would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of the institution he had served with unwavering dedication. The morning mist that had covered the castle grounds was beginning to lift, but inside the Queen Consort's drawing room, a different kind of storm was gathering. The confrontation that was about to unfold would echo through the corridors of power and forever change the delicate balance that had maintained the monarchy's stability for generations. Captain Harrison straightened his shoulders and prepared to face whatever challenge lay ahead, knowing that his next words would either preserve the honor of the Royal Guard or mark the beginning of its fundamental transformation under the new reign of King Charles III and Queen Camilla. The tension in Queen Camilla's private drawing room reached a breaking point as she walked slowly around Captain Harrison, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor with deliberate precision. Each step seemed calculated to emphasize her authority, while the morning lights streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the ornate Persian rug that had witnessed countless royal conversations over the decades. "You see, Captain," the Queen Consort continued, her voice taking on a tone that mixed royal authority with personal conviction. "The Royal Guard has operated under the same antiquated principles for far too long. The monarchy must evolve, and that evolution begins with those who serve it recognizing where true power now resides." Her words carried implications that made several of the palace staff members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Captain Harrison maintained his military bearing, though inwardly he was processing the unprecedented nature of what he was hearing. Throughout his career, he had served under 3 different monarchs, each with their own style and preferences, but none had ever suggested such fundamental changes to the Guard's traditional structure. The Royal Guard's loyalty had always been to the crown itself, not to individual preferences or personal agendas. Lady Margaret Thornfield, who had served the royal household for nearly 30 years, looked increasingly distressed as the conversation continued. Her intimate knowledge of palace protocol made it clear to her that what was transpiring went far beyond normal administrative adjustments. The way Queen Camilla was addressing Captain Harrison suggested a deliberate challenge to established hierarchies that had maintained stability within the monarchy for centuries. Sir Roderick Pemberton, meanwhile, appeared to be mentally calculating the potential consequences of the scene unfolding before him. As Deputy Master of Ceremonies, he understood better than most how delicate the balance was between different factions within the palace. Any significant disruption to the traditional order could have far-reaching effects on everything from daily operations to public perception of the monarchy's stability. The Queen Consort stopped directly in front of Captain Harrison, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that seemed designed to test his resolve. "I want you to understand something very clearly, Captain," she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate but no less commanding tone. The days when the Royal Guard could operate with autonomy, hiding behind centuries-old traditions and protocols, are over. You serve at the pleasure of the crown, and I am here to ensure that service reflects the realities of modern royal leadership. Harrison felt a familiar weight in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced during his most challenging military deployments when faced with orders that seemed to conflict with his fundamental understanding of duty and honor. The difference now was that instead of facing enemy forces on a battlefield, he was confronting a challenge from within the very institution he had dedicated his life to protecting. "Your Majesty," he replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a diplomat navigating treacherous political waters. "The Royal Guard has always served the crown with absolute loyalty. Our traditions and protocols exist not as obstacles to progress, but as safeguards to ensure that loyalty remains pure and untainted by personal interests or temporary political considerations." The Queen Consort's expression darkened at his response, clearly interpreting his words as a subtle challenge to her authority. She turned away from him and walked to the window, gazing out at the castle grounds where other members of the Royal Guard could be seen conducting their morning duties, unaware of the drama unfolding in the chamber above them. "Safeguards," she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call the stubborn resistance to necessary change that I have encountered since becoming Queen Consort? Your so-called safeguards have become barriers to effective governance and proper respect for the authority I represent." Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman struggling with frustrations that had clearly been building for some time. The other palace staff members exchanged increasingly worried glances as they recognized that this confrontation was escalating beyond what any of them had anticipated. Lady Margaret cleared her throat softly, perhaps hoping to provide some kind of diplomatic intervention, but the Queen Consort raised her hand in a gesture that clearly indicated she would not tolerate any interruption. Captain Harrison realized that he was approaching a crossroads that would define not only his own career, but potentially the future relationship between the Royal Guard and the monarchy itself. The Queen Consort's apparent frustration with traditional protocols suggested deeper conflicts within the royal household that went far beyond simple administrative preferences. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of a professional soldier addressing a superior. "If there are specific concerns about Guard operations or protocols, I would respectfully suggest that they be addressed through proper channels. Any changes to our fundamental structure should be discussed with military advisors and senior palace officials to ensure they serve the best interests of royal security and public confidence in the monarchy." Queen Camilla turned sharply from the window, her composure beginning to crack as her frustration with Harrison's diplomatic resistance became more apparent. The morning light behind her created an almost dramatic silhouette as she faced him with an expression that combined royal authority with personal anger. "Proper channels?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "Captain, I am the Queen Consort of England. I am the proper channel. The fact that you seem unable to recognize this fundamental reality is precisely the problem I am here to address." Her words carried an edge of steel that made everyone in the room tense with anticipation of what might come next. The antique clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady ticking, marking time in a room where centuries of royal tradition were being challenged in ways that none of the participants could have imagined when they began their respective careers in royal service. The very foundations of palace hierarchy were being tested in real time, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Harrison felt the weight of his 23 years of service pressing down upon him as he realized that his next response would likely determine the trajectory of the remainder of his career. The Queen Consort was clearly seeking some form of submission or acknowledgement of her authority that went beyond traditional protocols, but acquiescing to her demands could set precedents that might undermine the independence that had always been crucial to the Royal Guard's effectiveness. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "My loyalty to the crown is absolute and has never wavered throughout my years of service. However, that loyalty extends to preserving the integrity of institutions that have successfully protected the monarchy for generations. Any changes to those institutions should be carefully considered to ensure they strengthen rather than weaken the crown's security and stability." The Queen Consort's face flushed with anger at what she clearly perceived as continued resistance to her authority. She moved closer to Harrison, her posture becoming more aggressive as her frustration reached a boiling point. The other staff members in the room seemed to shrink back as they witnessed a confrontation that was spiraling beyond anything they had ever observed in their years of palace service. "Captain Harrison," Queen Camilla said, her voice now carrying unmistakable notes of command and barely controlled anger, "I believe you have fundamentally misunderstood your position and mine. Allow me to clarify the situation in terms that even your military mind should be able to comprehend." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever action she was preparing to take. The room fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the continued ticking of the clock, as everyone present realized they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed in palace corridors for years to come. The confrontation between traditional royal protocol and personal authority was reaching a climax that would test the very foundations of how the monarchy operated in the modern era. Harrison straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for whatever challenge the Queen Consort was about to present, knowing that his response would echo through the corridors of power and potentially reshape the relationship between the Royal Guard and the crown they had sworn to protect. The morning that had begun with routine expectations was rapidly becoming one of the most significant moments in his distinguished career. As Queen Camilla opened her mouth to deliver what would become the most shocking command of her tenure as Queen Consort, the very walls of Windsor Castle seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of words that would challenge centuries of tradition and forever change the delicate balance of power within the royal household. The silence in Queen Camilla's drawing room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap as she positioned herself directly before Captain Harrison, her eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed to draw power from the very walls of Windsor Castle that surrounded them. The morning light had shifted, casting sharper shadows across the ornate furnishings and creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to unfold. "Captain Harrison," the Queen Consort began, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone that somehow carried more menace than if she had shouted. "Since you seem unable to grasp the reality of modern royal authority through conventional discourse, perhaps a more direct demonstration is required." Her words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that reached every corner of the elegant chamber. Lady Margaret Thornfield found herself gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, while Sir Roderick Pemberton appeared to be mentally preparing himself for whatever unprecedented breach of protocol was about to occur. Both had served the royal household long enough to recognize when they were witnessing history in the making, though neither could have predicted the specific form that history would take. The Queen Consort moved with deliberate grace to a position that placed her at the center of the room, where the morning sunlight created an almost divine illumination around her figure. She had clearly choreographed this moment to maximize its psychological impact, understanding instinctively that royal authority was as much about perception and theatrical presentation as it was about formal power structures. "For too long," Queen Camilla continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of royal command, "members of this household have operated under the mistaken belief that tradition and protocol supersede the direct authority of the crown. This delusion ends today, and it ends with you, Captain Harrison," serving as an example to all who might harbor similar misconceptions about where power truly resides in this monarchy. Harrison felt his military training kick in as he recognized that he was facing not just a professional challenge, but a direct assault on the principles that had guided his entire career. The Queen Consort was clearly preparing to issue some form of command designed to force his submission to her personal authority, regardless of established protocols or traditional chains of command. The antique clock on the mantelpiece seemed to tick more loudly now, each second marking the approach of a moment that would test everything Harrison believed about duty, honor, and proper service to the crown. He could sense that whatever was about to happen would create precedents that would reverberate through the monarchy for generations to come. "Your Majesty," Harrison said, his voice maintaining its professional composure despite the growing tension in the room. "I remain ready to serve the crown according to the oath I swore, and the traditions that have effectively protected the royal family for centuries. If you have specific concerns about security protocols or operational procedures, I am prepared to address them through appropriate channels and consultations." Queen Camilla's expression shifted from anger to something approaching contempt as she interpreted his continued diplomatic language as defiance of her authority. She had clearly expected him to yield to the pressure of the confrontation, and his persistent adherence to proper protocols was fueling her frustration to dangerous levels. "Appropriate channels?" she repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. "Captain, I am standing before you as the Queen Consort of England, and you continue to speak of channels and consultations as if my direct command carries less weight than some dusty manual written by long-dead courtiers. Your attitude represents exactly the kind of institutional arrogance that I am determined to eliminate from this palace." The other staff members in the room seemed to shrink deeper into their chairs as they realized they were witnessing a confrontation that went far beyond normal palace politics. The Queen Consort's words suggested a fundamental challenge to the traditional balance between royal prerogative and institutional independence that had maintained stability within the monarchy for decades. Harrison could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him as he recognized that his next words might determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future autonomy of the Royal Guard itself. The Queen Consort was clearly seeking some form of dramatic submission that would establish her authority over traditional protocols, but yielding to such demands could compromise the independence that was essential to effective royal protection. "Your Majesty," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who had faced enemy fire and emerged unbroken. "My respect for your position is absolute, but my primary duty remains the protection of the crown and the preservation of institutions that have successfully served that purpose for generations. Any changes to fundamental protocols should be implemented in ways that strengthen rather than compromise the security and stability of the monarchy." Queen Camilla's face flushed with anger at what she perceived as continued resistance to her authority. She had clearly reached the limits of her patience with diplomatic language and traditional deference, and her next words would strip away any pretense of consultation or discussion. "Captain Harrison," she said, her voice now carrying the full power of royal command, "since you seem incapable of recognizing proper authority through normal discourse, I am going to provide you with a demonstration that will clarify the situation once and for all." Her tone suggested that whatever was about to happen would be designed to humiliate him before witnesses and establish her dominance over the traditional power structures of the palace. The room seemed to hold its breath as everyone present realized that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the modern history of the monarchy. The Queen Consort's body language and tone made it clear that she was preparing to issue a command that would challenge fundamental assumptions about royal protocol and the relationship between the crown and those who served it. Harrison straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for whatever challenge was about to be presented, knowing that his response would define not only his own legacy, but potentially the future relationship between the Royal Guard and the monarchy they had sworn to protect. The morning that had begun with routine expectations had evolved into a test of principles that would echo through the corridors of Windsor Castle for years to come. As Queen Camilla opened her mouth to deliver what would become the most shocking command of her tenure as Queen Consort, the very foundations of royal tradition seemed to tremble in anticipation of words that would forever change the balance of power within the palace walls. "Captain Harrison," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I hereby command you to kneel before me, and to order every member of your guard to do the same." You will demonstrate your loyalty to the new order of this monarchy by abandoning the arrogant independence that has characterized your service and acknowledging that your authority flows entirely through my grace and favor." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, their implications so shocking that even the experienced palace staff members gasped audibly at the unprecedented nature of the command. Lady Margaret covered her mouth with her hand, while Sir Roderick appeared to be mentally calculating the constitutional implications of what he had just witnessed. The Queen Consort had essentially demanded that the Royal Guard abandon their traditional independence and submit to her personal authority in a way that had no precedent in modern royal history. The command was designed not just to secure Harrison's submission, but to establish a new hierarchy that would place her personal authority above traditional protocols and institutional independence. Harrison felt the full weight of the moment settling upon him as he realized that his response to this unprecedented command would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the Royal Guard as an institution. The Queen Consort had forced him into a position where he would have to choose between personal survival and the preservation of principles that had guided his entire career. The morning sun continued to stream through the tall windows of the drawing room, but the light now seemed harsh and unforgiving, illuminating a confrontation that would be remembered as one of the most significant challenges to royal tradition in the modern era. The stage was set for a response that would shock the palace and forever change the relationship between the crown and those who served it. The aftermath of Queen Camilla's unprecedented command hung in the air of her private drawing room like smoke after an explosion, with every person present acutely aware that they had just witnessed something that would forever change the dynamics of royal service. Captain Harrison stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, though in reality only seconds passed, as he processed the magnitude of what had been demanded of him. The Queen Consort remained in her commanding position at the center of the room, her chin raised with an expression of absolute expectation. She had clearly anticipated that her dramatic ultimatum would force immediate compliance from a career soldier trained to obey orders without question. Her eyes blazed with the confidence of someone who believed that the sheer audacity of her command would overwhelm any resistance. Lady Margaret Thornfield felt her heart racing as she witnessed this unprecedented challenge to everything she understood about palace protocol and royal hierarchy. Throughout her 30 years of service, she had never seen anything approaching the constitutional crisis that was unfolding before her eyes. The Queen Consort's demand went far beyond normal assertions of authority and entered territory that could fundamentally destabilize the traditional relationship between the monarchy and its protective institutions. Sir Roderick Pemberton, meanwhile, was mentally cataloging the potential ramifications of what he was witnessing. As Deputy Master of Ceremonies, he understood better than most how carefully balanced the various power structures within the palace were, and how dramatically this confrontation could upset that balance. His mind raced through possibilities and precedents, finding none that offered guidance for the unprecedented situation developing in front of him. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to intensify as Captain Harrison slowly lifted his head, his steel-gray eyes meeting Queen Camilla's gaze with an expression that combined respect with unmistakable resolve. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, with the only sound being the steady ticking of the antique clock that had witnessed countless royal conversations over the decades. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent his entire career making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. The words came slowly, deliberately, each one chosen with the precision of a marksman taking aim at a target that could not be missed. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I have served the crown with unwavering loyalty for 23 years. I have faced enemy fire in foreign lands and stood guard over royal family members during their most vulnerable moments. I have never questioned a legitimate order, and I have never placed my personal interests above my duty to protect the monarchy." The Queen Consort's expression began to shift slightly as she detected something in his tone that suggested her dramatic command might not produce the immediate submission she had expected. Her confidence wavered almost imperceptibly as Harrison continued speaking with the measured cadence of a man who had carefully considered his words and their consequences. However, Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "My oath was sworn to the crown itself, not to personal interpretations of royal authority that contradict centuries of tradition and constitutional practice. The Royal Guard serves the monarchy as an institution, protecting it from all threats, whether they come from outside enemies or from internal actions that might compromise its stability and public trust. The room seemed to contract around his words as everyone present realized that Captain Harrison was not going to comply with the Queen Consort's unprecedented demand. Lady Margaret felt a mixture of admiration and terror as she witnessed this quiet act of institutional resistance that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone in royal service. Queen Camilla's face flushed with anger and disbelief as she processed the reality that her dramatic assertion of authority was being challenged by a mere captain of the guard. Her carefully orchestrated demonstration of power was crumbling before witnesses, potentially undermining her position within the palace hierarchy in ways that could prove difficult to recover from. "Captain Harrison," she said, her voice rising with barely controlled fury, "are you refusing a direct command from the Queen Consort of England? Do you understand the implications of such insubordination for your career and your future?" Her words carried threats that everyone in the room understood, but they also revealed her frustration at encountering resistance she had not anticipated. Harrison straightened his shoulders and took a step forward, his military bearing evident in every movement. The medals on his chest caught the morning light, each one representing years of faithful service and sacrifices made in the name of duty. His response would become legendary in palace circles, spoken in hushed tones for years to come. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice calm but carrying absolute conviction, "I kneel only to God and the crown that God has ordained. If you wish to see true loyalty, look not for submission to personal demands that contradict sacred oaths, but for the courage to preserve institutions that have successfully protected the monarchy through centuries of challenge and change." The words struck the room like lightning, their implications so profound that several seconds passed before anyone could fully process what had just occurred. Captain Harrison had not only refused the Queen Consort's command but had done so in language that elevated his resistance to the level of sacred duty rather than personal defiance. Sir Roderick Pemberton felt his hands trembling slightly as he realized he had just witnessed what historians would likely regard as one of the most significant assertions of institutional independence in modern royal history. The captain's response had transformed what could have been simple insubordination into a principled defense of constitutional tradition that would be difficult for anyone to dismiss as mere personal defiance. The Queen Consort staggered backward slightly, her carefully constructed authority shattered by the quiet dignity of Harrison's refusal. She had expected either immediate compliance or personal rebellion that could be easily punished, but instead had encountered something far more dangerous to her position. A principled resistance based on traditions that predated her own authority and commanded widespread respect throughout the palace. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice breaking slightly with rage and disbelief. "How dare you lecture me about loyalty while refusing to acknowledge my authority? You are nothing but a servant, Captain Harrison, and servants obey their betters without question or condition." Her words revealed the fundamental misunderstanding of royal service that had led to this confrontation. Harrison remained standing at attention, his expression unchanged despite the venom in the Queen Consort's response. "Your Majesty," he replied with quiet dignity, "I am indeed a servant, but I serve something greater than personal preferences or individual interpretations of authority. I serve the crown as it has existed for centuries, protected by traditions and oaths that ensure its stability and public trust." The confrontation had reached a point where neither party could retreat without significant consequences. The Queen Consort had staked her authority on securing Harrison's submission, while the captain had committed himself to defending principles that went to the very heart of royal service and constitutional tradition. Lady Margaret watched in fascination and horror as the drama unfolded, knowing that whatever happened next would set precedents that would influence palace politics for decades to come. The quiet captain's unexpected resistance had transformed what was intended to be a demonstration of royal power into a constitutional crisis that would test the very foundations of modern monarchy. As the morning sun reached its zenith outside the windows of Queen Camilla's drawing room, the confrontation between traditional authority and personal command had reached a climax that would reverberate through the corridors of Windsor Castle and beyond, forever changing the relationship between the crown and those sworn to protect it. The silence that followed Captain Harrison's dignified refusal seemed to stretch across eternity, with the very walls of Windsor Castle appearing to hold. their breath as the implications of his words settled over Queen Camilla's drawing room like dust after an earthquake. The morning light had shifted again, now casting longer shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what had just transpired between the Queen Consort and the steadfast captain of the Royal Guard. Queen Camilla stood frozen in the center of the room, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something approaching panic as she realized that her carefully orchestrated demonstration of authority had backfired spectacularly. Instead of establishing her dominance over traditional palace hierarchies, she had inadvertently created a situation that highlighted the very constitutional principles she had sought to override. The presence of witnesses made the situation exponentially more complicated for the Queen Consort. Lady Margaret Thornfield and Sir Roderick Pemberton had observed every moment of the confrontation, and their positions within the palace hierarchy meant that news of what had occurred would inevitably spread throughout the royal household. The story of a royal guard captain refusing to kneel before the Queen Consort would become the subject of whispered conversations in every corner of the castle. Captain Harrison remained at attention, his military bearing unchanged despite having just delivered what amounted to a constitutional challenge to royal authority. His steel-gray eyes held steady on a point just above Queen Camilla's head, maintaining the respectful distance required by protocol, while simultaneously demonstrating that his resistance was based on principle rather than personal defiance. The antique clock on the mantelpiece continued its relentless marking of time, each tick now seeming to count down toward consequences that none of the participants could fully anticipate. The confrontation had moved far beyond personal disagreement and entered territory where constitutional tradition, royal prerogative, and institutional independence collided in ways that could reshape the monarchy itself. Sir Roderick Pemberton found himself mentally calculating the political ramifications of what he had witnessed, understanding that the story would inevitably reach King Charles III and force decisions about the balance of power within the royal household. The Deputy Master of Ceremonies had served long enough to know that such confrontations, once witnessed by multiple parties, could never be contained or quietly resolved. Lady Margaret, meanwhile, was experiencing a mixture of admiration for Captain Harrison's principled stand and terror at the potential consequences for everyone present. She had spent 3 decades navigating palace politics with careful diplomacy, and the idea that such a direct constitutional challenge could occur in her presence left her feeling exposed to retribution from either side of the conflict. Queen Camilla's breathing became visibly labored as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. She had intended to use Captain Harrison as an example to establish her authority over traditional palace structures, but instead had created a situation where her own understanding of royal power was being publicly questioned by someone whose reputation for loyalty and integrity was unassailable. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying unmistakable venom. "All of you, get out of my sight before I do something that we will all regret." The words were spoken through clenched teeth, and everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing the collapse of a carefully constructed plan that had spectacularly failed to achieve its intended objectives. Captain Harrison executed a perfect military bow, his movements precise and respectful despite the obvious anger radiating from the Queen Consort. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "I remain available to discuss any legitimate security concerns through proper channels and consultations with appropriate palace officials." His words maintained the diplomatic language of royal service, while subtly reinforcing that her dramatic demand had fallen outside normal protocols. As the 3 palace staff members filed out of the drawing room, the silence behind them was deafening. Queen Camilla was left alone with the wreckage of her authority, while Captain Harrison walked through the corridors of Windsor Castle with the knowledge that his career would never be the same, regardless of whether his principled stand was ultimately vindicated or punished. The news of the confrontation spread through the palace with the speed of wildfire, carried by whispered conversations between trusted staff members who understood the significance of what had occurred. Within hours, virtually every person in royal service had heard some version of the story about the captain who refused to kneel, and the Queen Consort who had demanded submission to her personal authority. King Charles III received word of the incident while reviewing state papers in his private study, and the report left him deeply troubled by the implications for palace unity and public perception of the monarchy. The confrontation between his wife and one of the most respected members of the Royal Guard created political complications that would require careful handling to prevent lasting damage to royal institutions. The aftermath of the morning's events rippled outward in ways that surprised even those who had participated directly. Captain Harrison found himself receiving quiet expressions of support from colleagues throughout the palace, while Queen Camilla discovered that her attempt to assert dominance had instead isolated her from many staff members who valued traditional protocols and constitutional principles. Within days, it became clear that the confrontation had fundamentally altered the balance of power within the royal household. Captain Harrison's dignified refusal to submit to an unprecedented demand had established him as an unlikely symbol of institutional integrity, while Queen Camilla's dramatic overreach had raised questions about her understanding of constitutional monarchy and proper royal authority. The resolution of the crisis came through careful diplomatic intervention by senior palace officials who recognized that both parties needed pathways to preserve their dignity while preventing further constitutional challenges. King Charles III himself ultimately intervened, reaffirming traditional protocols while privately counseling both his wife and Captain Harrison about the need for institutional stability. In the weeks that followed, Captain Harrison continued his duties with unchanged dedication, though his status within the palace had been permanently elevated by his principled stand during the confrontation. His refusal to compromise sacred oaths had earned him respect that extended far beyond the royal guard and into the highest levels of royal service. Queen Camilla gradually adjusted her approach to palace management, learning from the failed confrontation that royal authority was most effective when exercised within traditional frameworks rather than through dramatic personal assertions that challenged constitutional principles. The morning's events served as a costly but valuable lesson in the complexities of modern monarchy. The story of Captain Harrison's one-line response to Queen Camilla's unprecedented command became part of palace legend, spoken of in hushed tones as an example of how principled resistance could preserve institutional integrity even when facing the highest levels of royal authority. His simple declaration that he knelt only to God and the crown became a touchstone for discussions about proper service and constitutional tradition. Years later, historians would mark the confrontation in Queen Camilla's drawing room as a pivotal moment in the evolution of the modern British monarchy, demonstrating how traditional institutions could adapt and survive challenges to their independence while maintaining the respect and stability that ensured their continued effectiveness in protecting the crown. The morning that began with routine expectations had ended with fundamental changes to palace dynamics that would influence royal service for generations to come. Captain Harrison's quiet courage in defense of constitutional principles had shown that true loyalty sometimes required resistance to authority that overstepped traditional boundaries, preserving the very institutions that made effective royal service possible.